The first half of this verse covers how major corporations shift the blame for anthropogenic climate change onto regular, everyday people, even though they are the ones who are causing almost all of the damage. These lines were inspired by Stephanie McMillan and Derek Jensen's graphic novel called As the World Burns, 50 Simple Things You Can Do to Stay in Denial, which I'll be referencing a few times in this video. At the beginning of the novel, one of the characters gives different tips and tricks to reduce your carbon footprint and says, "Oh, and you'll love this one since you love nature. Plant a tree. A single tree will absorb 1 ton of CO2 during its lifetime." Then, this character's friend says, "How about if we stop someone from cutting down a tree?" This same friend responds to these tips and tricks by saying, "But there was nothing about stopping the governments and corporations that are the main causes of the problems. Did you know that all by itself, ExxonMobil has released 5% of all carbon emissions put out by this culture? They're the real problems, not us." A page on Client Earth's website titled The Greenwashing Files, ExxonMobil, states that the company says it captures about 9 million tons of CO2 per year. This represents less than 2% of its 2019 annual emissions of 730 million tons of CO2. This is roughly equivalent to the emissions of the entire country of Canada. To give another example of major corporations causing extreme harm to the environment, Shell, one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world, developed a carbon footprint calculator, even though it's among the top 20 companies responsible for over 1/3 of all carbon emissions since 1965. Their core business model depends on fossil fuel extraction, which contributes massively to global warming. By promoting personal carbon calculators, Shell subtly shifts the burden of climate action onto individuals, rather than acknowledging its own systemic role in the climate crisis. It's like a cigarette company telling smokers to take better care of their lungs while continuing to mass-produce cigarettes. The second half of this verse focuses on how rates of depression and anxiety are at an all-time high, and unfortunately, doctors can't do much except offer therapy and psychiatric medications. The root of the problem is still there, though: systemic, social, and environmental injustice. According to a page on the CDC's website titled New Reports Highlight Depression Prevalence and Medication Use in the U.S., new data from the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics indicate that the prevalence of depression in U.S. adolescents and adults increased by 60% in the past decade. Findings from this report include the following: the prevalence of depression is higher in females compared to males. As age increased, the prevalence of depression decreased. Almost 90% of adolescents and adults reported difficulty with work, home, or social activities due to their depression symptoms, and a higher percentage of females than males with depression reported receiving therapy. I was diagnosed with depression when I was 10 or 11, and I've dealt with mental health issues for most of my life, so I can speak from experience when I say that my depression symptoms have been exacerbated by the state of the world, influenced by the hatred that seeps out of the U.S.'s current administration, deforestation and the extinction of countless species, the insane income inequality between the rich and the poor, and more. Anyway, the last point about this part of the verse that I want to make is that it was also inspired by the graphic novel I mentioned earlier. There is a section in the novel where one of the characters is encouraged to go to therapy because her friend says she's too depressed and pessimistic about the state of the world, and the therapist encourages her to start taking antidepressants. Let me preface this by saying that I'm going to read a really long quote, but it's a very important one. So, the character asks the therapist, "So it will no longer bother me that our planet is being destroyed by greedy corporations? I won't cry anymore about the frog species going extinct or the polar bears swimming through the ocean to ice that's no longer there? I won't be haunted anymore by the ghosts of numberless war dead, soldiers and civilians, lost friends and broken families? The agony that I feel about all the people being kidnapped and legally tortured by the government will ease off? The screaming won't trouble my dreams anymore? The rage I feel about people being worked to death and still being unable to feed their families or afford healthcare, this anger will subside? All these bad feelings will magically vanish with a little pill, and I'll be happy and adjusted to this gruesome reality, this ravaged planet and suffering people? Is that what you're saying? My sorrow, my empathy, my caring, my sensitivity. You want to kill all that so I'll be productive, so I'll be more useful to the big capitalist machine. Do I have it right? Why not just cut out my heart and be done with it? And the therapist says, I'm gonna give you a bit of a higher dosage than I planned initially. Similarly to rates of depression, the Earth's temperature is at an all-time high, and natural disasters are more devastating than ever. Disaster capitalism takes advantage of this, with developers and the military seizing destroyed land for their own private interests. Anthony Lowenstein's book, titled Disaster Capitalism: Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe, delves into how corporations and governments exploit crises such as wars, natural disasters, and economic collapses for profit. He illustrates how neoliberal policies and privatization efforts often intensify human suffering under the guise of aid and development. For instance, in Haiti, following the 2010 earthquake, international aid efforts were largely managed by private contractors like Chemonics, leading to inefficient and profit-driven responses that sidelined local communities. Another work I want to reference is Neil Smith's essay called There's No Such Thing as a Natural Disaster. He contends that disasters aren't solely the result of natural events, but are significantly shaped by social, economic, and political factors. Using Hurricane Katrina as a primary example, he illustrates how societal structures and inequalities determine the severity and impact of such events. So, while natural phenomena like hurricanes and earthquakes occur, whether they become disasters depends on human factors such as preparedness and infrastructure. The response to disasters often prioritizes property and economic interests over human lives. During Hurricane Katrina, military efforts focused on protecting property rather than aiding stranded residents, which reflects a tendency to value assets over people. Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for civil rights through nonviolent protesting, while Malcolm X and the Black Panthers encouraged using violent tactics to overthrow the government. There are so many protests going on today, some of which I have attended in Walnut Creek, and by the way, there are protests every Saturday in Broadway Plaza, but I've heard many people wonder if this is enough to make lasting change. This verse was, once again, inspired by the graphic novel. The quote from the novel that resonated with me was, "Why do you hate violence that frees the victims of greater violence, even more than you hate the original violence?" Two characters are discussing this concept. One of them says he will not commit an act of violence, and the other character says, "Even to stop a greater one? It seems like you don't want to be responsible for anything." The thesis of my project is that granting more political power to marginalized groups, such as women and people of color, would be a highly effective way to solve many injustices on our planet due to their increased focus on solidarity, community, and diversity because of the injustices they have personally experienced. This thesis is demonstrated in the chorus through the lyrics, "We could learn so much from our mothers and the ones who know the land." Our mothers are the women that we look up to, who can teach us important life lessons and have had complex life experiences because of their gender and how society views women. The Ones Who Know the Land was inspired by Indigenous people's knowledge of and connection to the earth, and how a lot of the information that was passed down from generation to generation is incredibly relevant and important, especially in this day and age when there are so many changes happening to the Earth's climate and environment. According to a recent report by women political leaders titled Representation Matters, Women Political Leaders, a higher rate of women political representation is closely linked to legal equality and economic opportunity. This is very important information because legal equality and economic opportunity pave the way for a healthier economy, a healthier society, and a healthier world. Carrie Lotsoff's article titled Why Climate Change is Sexist explores how climate change disproportionately affects women, particularly in developing countries. It highlights that women often face greater risks due to existing gender inequalities, such as limited access to resources, education, and decision-making power. These disparities make it more challenging for women to adapt to climate-related impacts like food and water scarcity, displacement, and health issues. Another thing I want to explore is the concept of racial capitalism. Robin D.G. Kelly released an article titled, What Did Cedric Robinson Mean by Racial Capitalism?, in which he argues that capitalism has always been intertwined with racial hierarchies. It's not a neutral economic system that later became racist, but one born out of racial domination. He asserts that we can't fully understand or combat economic inequality without acknowledging how deeply race is woven into the fabric of capitalist systems. To expand on this point, the article by Rosemary Claire Collard and Jessica Dempsey, titled Accumulation by Difference Making, an Anthropocene Story Starring Witches, examines how capitalist accumulation relies on producing and exploiting differences, particularly along lines of gender, race, and species. They argue that this process, which they term accumulation by difference making, is foundational to the idea of the Anthropocene, defined as the current geological era marked by significant human impact on Earth's geology and ecosystems. It goes without saying that the majority of people in power in the world don't have the best interests of the common people in mind. When powerful and rich people wage war, it's the regular, everyday people that pay the cost, often resulting in displacement, the loss of their lives, emotional pain, and more. Jesse Wells, an up-and-coming singer-songwriter who excellently encapsulates the work of artists like Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger with his moving protest music, recently uploaded an inspiring video reciting a compilation of quotes from the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre, an existentialist French philosopher known for his fierce opposition to war and colonialism. Wells states, "The heroism of war is a lie. It's not the bravest who fight, but those who have no other choice. It's not the noble who die, but those who are least equipped to avoid death. The glory of war is a mask put on to cover the despair of a people without a hope." Similarly to the point that Wells makes in the video that he uploaded, as well as in his music, this verse highlights how colonialism conquers those who have no other choice, and how our capitalist society has evolved to the point where people have no other choice but to sell their bodies and sell their labor to their employers in order to make a living. The last line of this verse highlights how neoliberalist capitalism tells us that there's nothing we can do to change the system. Neoliberalism gives us false hope, spreading a message that we can't save the earth by planting a tree, but you also can't save the world by doing nothing. Both of these attitudes are rooted in false hope, creating a purposeful sense of hopelessness within society that is meant to keep all of us stuck in the system. An article by Martin Lukács titled "Neoliberalism Has Conned Us into Fighting Climate Change as Individuals" critiques neoliberalism for promoting the idea that market-based solutions and individual consumer choices can effectively address climate change. He argues that while personal efforts like recycling or using energy-efficient appliances are well-intentioned, they are insufficient. He emphasizes that such actions can distract from the need to challenge the larger systems and corporations that are the primary drivers of environmental degradation. Highlighting a 2017 study, Lukács notes that just 100 companies have been responsible for 71% of global carbon emissions since 1988. This verse explains how colonialism and imperialism have claimed countless innocent lives in these conquerors' mission to exploit the native people of the conquered lands as well as the land itself for economic gain. William Cronin's concept of wilderness, which can be found in his essay, The Trouble with Wilderness, or Getting Back to the Wrong Nature, challenges the traditional Western conception of wilderness as a pristine, untouched realm separate from human influence. He argues that this idea is a cultural construct rather than an objective reality. This makes it incredibly important for us to pay attention to climate change and do our best to serve environmental justice to all, because when we harm the earth, we harm ourselves. To add on to Cronin's work, he points out that this romanticized view of wilderness ignores the historical presence and influence of indigenous peoples, who actively managed and shaped these landscapes long before European colonization. By erasing this history, the wilderness ideal perpetuates a false dichotomy between humans and nature. The second pre-chorus isn't really inspired by any articles I've read, but rather it's inspired by my own emotions and experiences. Despite all the organizing that's going on throughout the country and even around the world, I still feel overwhelmingly powerless. I scroll through social media and I constantly see awful things happening everywhere, and it's hard to feel confident that you're actually making a change by donating, raising awareness, educating yourself, and other things like that. Nevertheless, I will continue going to protests. I will continue educating myself. I will continue raising awareness, and I will continue fighting. I have hope that together we can make a change. As I end this video, I'd like to share that I have a bunch of links in my link tree, which you can find in the description, that explain how you can help make the world a better place, covering topics such as stopping climate change, taking action for Gaza, preventing gun violence, and more. I'd really appreciate it if you took a minute to check it out. Thanks for listening.